We live in a beautiful world. It's true. I was born in a particularly beautiful pocket in it, about 45 minutes to the cliffs of Malibu where the waves of the endless summer run forever, about half a day, to the redwoods and to the sequoias. And when I came here, to the lesser coast, I learned to love it here too. It's so green. Spring shouts viridian at you. The world is a beautiful place. And I was in a beautiful place at the beginning of the summer, Isabella Friedman Retreat Center, spiritual home of renewal and neo-Chassidut. And we were studying Torah there together with one of my teachers, and in the middle of the study, someone said, "Go outside. You have to go outside right now." And we did. And we watched as the sky changed from clear to gray to orange and then to a deep and angry red. Smoke and ash from wildfires more than 500 miles away in Canada had come, and I drove home that night, and I was trying to describe to Yael just how eerie it was, but by the next day I didn't have to, because it hit New York City. And there it stayed for 3 days. And I knew what I was going to speak about on Yom Kippur. Sometimes the spiritual work is this. The spiritual work is to say the truth that we all already have acknowledged in our hearts, but maybe have not had the temerity to say it out loud. The Midrash calls these things, by the way, the things that are stuck between the heart and the mouth. And that's what we have to do right now, because we can't talk about climate change without saying the climate has in fact changed. It's here. We thought we had more time. We hoped we had more time. We should have done more, but it's here now, today, and also tomorrow. We got to deal with it. All summer long, I've been asking myself the question, how do I talk to you about this? When so much brilliant ink has already been spilled and so little done, how do I say something that's meaningful? And I was emailing with Marcella about it, and she wrote back something. She's like, the problem with thinking about how to respond to climate change is it's so big, it's so all-encompassing. And she is right. In the enormity of the challenges that we face and the way that we'll have to change ourselves as individuals in a culture, I can imagine that a person would feel, how could you not feel, a kind of inner paralysis, an inability to do something about it, and also a certain amount of cynicism. Is there really anything to be done? I could imagine us feeling that way. I know that a lot of us feel that way. I hear the way we talk about it, and I hear the tone and sound in people's voices, and that is what I hear. But inner paralysis and cynicism, those are spiritual conditions. Those are spiritual maladies. And within a whole world of responses that we need to have to the fact that the climate has changed, to ameliorate its effects and also to care for those who are vulnerable, who will be most affected by it, the small puzzle piece that we can bring in tonight, here and now, is to defeat paralysis and overcome cynicism. And I'm telling you right now, it's possible because 3,000 years of Jewish history prove it. What can I say to you? I can speak to you of the tradition that knows what it means to find hope and optimism in very, very difficult circumstances. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. What I want to speak to you about is actually why it's important that we grieve in certain ways, that we acknowledge a certain kind of sadness in a very particular Jewish way. And from the grief, we go to growth. And the growth looks like this, that you and I acknowledge deep in our hearts, straight in our mind, that the work before us is our work, that we accepted upon ourselves, and we move ourselves from a place of, well, ain't no one's going to do something about it, to the place that we are going to do something about it. That's the piece that we can do. I can't save the world, but I can talk about this. And you, my dear community, already have the seeds of this in you. I know because I see it in you every day. So let's get into it. First, we're going to do this like a Pesach Seder. We're going to start with the bad stuff, and we're going to go to the inspirational stuff. Right? And hopefully it'll take less than 3 hours. So there we go. Let's get into it. And I want to talk about what it means to have a certain amount of grief for what has happened to the world. And I will get to the place to where we connect it with what's going on in the climate right now. But first, I have to say that when Jews speak of grief, there's no way to do it except by talking about the temple that was in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, as my voice gives out in the middle of my Devar. It can be very hard to understand what the possible relevance is of a building that was destroyed 2,000 years ago. It can be hard to feel that as something that's alive and real. But I feel it in my bones. And the reason that I feel it is because it was taught to me. And what my teacher said to me was this. They said, you have to understand, Scott, this isn't just about the destruction of a landmark. It's about the way that a whole culture was overturned overnight. We, before we were the people of the book, were the people of the place. We had a place, Jerusalem, Israel. That was our place. It was our home. And all of a sudden, it was gone. And that's why we keep on mentioning it, because it was such a catastrophe. And it turns out that in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, there were people who descended into a kind of perpetual mourning every single day. A forever mourning, a forever grief. They stopped eating meat, not because they cared about the environment. They stopped eating meat because it reminded them of the sacrifices in the temple. Oy. And they stopped drinking wine because it reminded them of the kiddush that used to be made in the temple. Oy. And they stopped listening to music, if you can believe it. Why? Because the temple, like our services, was a place of inspired music and instruments. It was only after the destruction of the temple that people said, you can't play music on Shabbos and Yom Kippur anymore. We're bringing that back. That's what this whole service is about. And a tremendous rabbi, the greatest of his generation, Rabbi Joshua, goes to visit this group of people. He was brilliant. But you know what? All the other rabbis were brilliant too. Any rabbi you see written down, brilliant. We do well with that. What made him special was not his intellect, it's that he was wise. He had what they call in Hebrew and Yiddish seichel. He had an understanding behind the understanding, as you will see in the story that I'm about to tell you. So Rabbi Yeshua goes to these people and he says, I see you don't eat the meat and I see you don't drink the wine. They said, yes, Rabbi, destruction of the temple, no more, we're so sad. And he says, I think you shouldn't eat bread either. Well, it makes sense. Every week, 12 beautiful challahs, not small challahs, like those crazy bar mitzvah challahs. You know what the ones I'm talking about? 12 huge challahs were placed in the temple before Shabbos, the lechem apanim, the bread that was shown. And the temple doesn't exist anymore. We can't do it. So you should not eat bread. Oh, they love this. You're absolutely right, Rabbi Yeshua. We shouldn't eat bread. There's a kind of personality that prefers chosen suffering over suffering that is, right, shows your powerlessness. They're totally into it. Yes, we're not going to eat bread anymore. Thank you. So wise. And Rabbi Yeshua says, you shouldn't eat fruit either. And they said, fruit? He said, once a year, we used to bring the first fruits to the temple, and they would tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and we can't do that anymore. And this time, the group is a little less sanguine about the whole thing. And they're like, oh, that's so smart, Rabbi. We won't eat the fruits that were offered in the temple, but let me slip this orange into my pocket. He says, very good. He says, now they're worried. You shouldn't drink water either. Because of the festival of the water, the Nisuch HaMayim that was around Sukkot. We can't do that anymore. Don't drink water. And they're silent. Because they understand what he's doing. They understand why he's come and what his point is. And he reaches out to them in kindness. And he goes, my children, not to mourn at all is impossible. Nigzar HaGezerah, the temple is destroyed. You can't not feel. But to mourn too much is also impossible. No one can bear it. So instead of what you're doing, do this. When you build a house, leave a square foot of the wall that you're building unplastered, unfinished, in memory of the destruction of the temple. And when you serve a meal, leave off one small dish in memory of the destruction of the temple. The Talmud is a weird book, so for some reason at this point, somebody jumps in and says, it should be French fries. I'm not kidding, it says small fried potatoes. Why? Some things are even beyond me. And this is the most interesting one. He says, when a couple goes to get married, take a small bit of ash and place it on the bridegroom's head, where the tefillin lay, in memory of the destruction of the temple. And the reason that this is the most interesting one is because we still do it, even though the means of the ritual have changed. Because at every Jewish wedding, at the end of it, somebody, in memory of the destruction of the temple, that's why that ritual is there. And then he says it. He says the line. He says the thing. He says the reason is because those who mourn for Jerusalem will merit to see it rebuilt in joy. All who remember Jerusalem in sadness will one day rejoice when redemption comes. If you know about human psychology, it's so wise and such a smart thing, because the truth is that over-mourning and denial are two sides of the same coin. They're both a kind of refusal to move on as the world is moving on, to grow and to find a new way. If you sink yourself down in mourning, you're stuck in the past. And if you refuse to see it, you're stuck in the past. And he says the one thing that you're not allowed to be is stuck. So instead, take the sadness and put it in the center. Don't overdo it and don't underdo it. And right in the middle of the sadness, I want you to plant a seed of hope. And in there, hope will remain eternal, because memory defeats paralysis. If you remember over and over again, it defeats the idea that you're stuck. It will push you forward, I promise you. That's the Jewish way. Now, the world is not destroyed, far from it. Look at us here today. The world is not destroyed, and yet there have been destructions, and we have to remember them. And what I mean by that is one of the most salient ones is that summer is no longer just going to be the season in which we vacation. It's also going to be the season in which a series of extreme climate events happen as we watch. And sometimes they will happen to us. And I watched this summer as the fires came and the rains came and the heat came and the fire in Maui came and the hurricane hit Los Angeles. That might have been a sign of something, I don't know. There are no hurricanes in Los Angeles, except for now. I watched, and what I saw is first when the news came out, people were angry and shocked, and then they were full of compassion, and they tried to help, and then they were sad, and about 3 days later, we stopped talking about it. When was the last time you talked about the ash cloud above Manhattan that lasted for 3 days? It's natural for us to do it. There's a part of our brain that's built to forget, especially painful experiences. We want to look away. We need to look away because we have to get on with the rest of our lives, right? There's a piece of us that's built to do exactly that. The only problem is if we accept this as normal, God forbid. And so we have to almost go against our own nature a little bit and inject memory into our lives to help us remember what has been lost and what needs to be recovered. If you come, by the way, to Rome, Brooklyn on Shabbat, you'll see that I'm going to do one different thing. This minhag may have to change and grow a little bit until we find the right way. But before we make Kiddush on Shabbat, I'm going to say one line, a line from the book of Genesis that talks about the Garden of Eden and how beautiful it was and how so much was good to eat in there. And you will see me very quietly spill out a little of my wine from the Kiddush cup so that not on the floor. Some of people are worried. I will spill out a little wine from my Kiddush cup so that I, every week, remember what's happening. And you can too, if you want to join me. From memory, we have to grow and grow stronger. And the thing that I want to say is that we have to find a certain new understanding of what our work in the world is. What do I mean by that? There's a mitzvah in the Torah that not everyone here has heard about. It's called ma'aser. Can you say ma'aser? Ma'aser. It means a tenth. And we use the English word for it, by the way, is tithing. There are some Christian churches that still require their members to tithe 10% of their income to the church. Wow. We thought dues were expensive, right? 10% of their income to the church, but it's really not a functional mitzvah, and there's a good reason for it, because Maaser existed in a world of agriculture. When people grew their own crops and raised their own animals, every year in ancient Israel, what they would do is they would take 10% of their stuff, and they would say, it was never my stuff. It was my job to raise it, to grow it, to tend to it, to harvest it, and then to get it where it needed to go. And every year they would take 10% of what they had and they would either give it to the temple or they would give it to the poor, depending on the year. And this was a hallowed and celebrated part of ancient Israel. And the reason we don't do it is because we just don't barter anymore. We moved from stuff to money. We moved from barter to finance. And so Maaser sort of faded into the background, and it was replaced by its better-known cousins, tzedakah and chesed. And it is the reason, by the way, that when you talk about giving tzedakah, what's the sort of recommended amount of tzedakah in Judaism that you're supposed to give? 10%. That's where that comes from. A few hundred years ago, a rabbi that the kind of people know him, love him, grabbed that mitzvah up again. His name was Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. He was amazing. The head of the Volozhin yeshiva, an incredible mystic, an unbelievable scholar. And he said, it's possible that in our time, this idea of giving a tenth might not be just about your stuff, might not be about your corn, it might be about your time. Maybe there's an obligation, he says, to give 10% of your time to the world. And the context, by the way, in which this discussion happened was so interesting. He was speaking not to everybody, but actually to other Torah scholars. And he was saying to them, if you're studying Torah, you really have an obligation to give 10% of your time to teach Torah. And not to your graduate students, by the way, not to the ones who are going to be scholars like you, but to the ones specifically who are going to not be like you. The ones who are not going to come and be like the next Chaim of Volozhins. Now, scholars then were as they are now. I'm very well aware that my child is one of the people back there. If it's possible to grab Sella or Kate and to see if there's a way that we can put them downstairs. Love you. Okay, Maaser, back to Maaser, and back to Maaser of giving your time. He was trying to convince scholars that they should give 10% of their time to teach people that they would not normally teach. And by the way, if the whole idea of resisting teaching people sounds parsimonious and mean to you, that's because it is. It's kind of ungenerous. But scholars then, or as scholars might be now, you know the term publish or perish? Back then, it was bitul Torah, time taken away from studying Torah. They didn't want to give up their time. And before we judge them too much, by the way, I have to ask you a question, which is, how much of our time do we give to the betterment of the world? How much of our daily life are we willing to give? Is it 1 hour? Out of every 10 that you're spending? Look, there are people in this room, by the way, who actually do spend that time and more. There are truly righteous people in this room, and I know them. But for the rest of us, an hour out of every 10 for the bettering of the world? I tried it. Over the summer during Elul, the month of spiritual preparation before Rosh Hashanah, I tried it. I was going to give a maaser of my time to the planet. I sat down with amazing, soon-to-be rabbi, former Romu Brooklyn board member Aaron Viola, and we divided my time up to celebration, to sadness, to activism, and to teaching my children. And I was going to spend time every day. And I'll just be perfectly honest with you, it was super hard. I didn't even give a maaser. It was more like a shmaser. I gave like 30 minutes a day to this. And I'm going to get back to why it was hard in a second, because I'll also tell you that it was really beautiful. I spent time writing letters to senators and members of the city council. I spent time writing about what I was sad about that my children had to face that I didn't. I spent time walking in the woods. I spent time with my kids peering at little inchworms and little spiders that eat the little inchworms. I finally learned the name of the tree that grows above my balcony in the back of my apartment. It was absolutely beautiful and worth it. And every minute that I did it, I felt like I was stealing time away from my work. I felt like I wasn't doing my job. A full accounting of my hours will be sent to the Roma Brooklyn board after this. I don't mean my job as a rabbi. I mean like my job to work as a rabbi and my job to raise my kids and my job to clean the house and to cook dinner. I felt like I was stealing. It was discretionary. It felt like it was optional. It didn't feel like my work. It felt like a treasure that I was giving myself. And it felt, by the way, like, side piece at best. I don't know how to fix the world, I've already told you, but I cannot imagine that it begins without us being willing to give of our time. And so the thing I want to explore with you is, what does it mean to actually say something like this is not optional, but is in fact work that we should imagine ourselves doing as part of our job? Let me tell you another story, and then I'll let you go. Not a long one. Talmud talks about a Rebbe Preda. And I'm pretty sure, by the way, this is the only time that we run into Rebbe Preda in the Talmud. Rebbe Preda had a student who had extreme learning disability. It was very hard for this student to learn, but the student wanted to learn. And so the Talmud tells us that Rebbe Preda would sit down and he would study a page of Talmud with that student 400 times. Is the Talmud exaggerating? Probably, but it sounds good. 400 times. And at the end of the 400th time, the student would learn. And one day, Rebbe Preda was teaching the student the 400 times, and someone came in and said, Rebbe, we need you for a mitzvah outside. And he says, I'll be along presently. And he continues to teach this guy the 400 times. And at the end of the 400 times, the kid has not learned. And Rebbe Preda says to him, what gives? And he said, listen, when the guy came through the door, I got distracted. I thought you were going to leave any moment, and so I just couldn't concentrate. And you know what Rabbi Preda does? He sat back down and taught him another 400 times. And the kid learned. And then he went to the Devar mitzvah, the matter of the mitzvah, and a voice, the Talmud teaches, comes out from heaven and says, for the 400 times, Rabbi Preda is granted 400 years of life. Definitely an exaggeration, but again, sounds good. And you have to ask yourself the question, what was it that allowed Rabbi Preda to teach this student 400 times? It could only be one thing. It could only be one thing. And I'm telling you, it was not goodwill and generosity of heart. That gets you 11 and a half times. What allowed him to teach this student 400 times? He thought of it as his job. My job is to teach this kid. I'll teach the kid as long as it takes it. It was his job. What is our job? Secret that every rabbi knows. Your employer is the community, and you owe the community a full measure of your work, a full day's work and then some. But you work as a rabbi, I work for, that's my job. And in between those two things, the community that I serve and the God that I serve through you, is where rabbis find their fire and their passion. The best rabbis in the world find the middle space between those two things and create something amazing. They know what their employment is, and they also know what their job is. And I wonder, maybe this is not just a teaching for rabbis. What if you got up every morning and asked yourself, what is my job, and who do I work for? And if somehow the world that gave us birth, that sustains us and feeds us and gives us more beauty than we could possibly imagine isn't on that list, ask again. And so my request to you this year is that you also make a maaser of your time, or a shmaser of your time, whatever works, to find the percentage of time that you have either every day, once a week. I don't care how it is you do it, but sometimes the answer to cynicism and paralysis is GCAL. Because if you put things in your schedule and you treat them like they are your job, they work, you work. If you don't treat them as discretionary, you treat them as central, you will find yourself doing them. Sometimes it's the fake it till you make it. Sometimes it's the practical thing that lifts us up, yanks us beyond our feelings about what's going on, and puts us to work where we ought to be. Beautiful passage in the morning service that I hope we'll start saying now on a regular basis, right next to the Modeh Ani. Hareini mekabel alai mitzvat boreh. Behold, I accept upon myself the commandment of the Creator, le'ahavta recha kamocha, to love my neighbor as myself. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, you know where that commandment to give 10% of your time comes from? From loving your neighbor as yourself, because some of the love that you have is due not only to you, but to outside of you. This is our work. This is our work. Let the world be our work. We can do this. Let it be our work. Who do you work for? And what is your job? Shana Tova. Oh, what a coincidence that we have this song to sing right now. It's on your song sheets.